So it's a real pleasure to introduce Jake Beck, who was an undergraduate here at Penn in philosophy and in cognitive science, and did a senior thesis on Richard Samuels on Twitter thought experiment. Some very recent traditional philosophical questions like philosophical examples, sort of early modern philosophical examples. He's made some progress in primary. So he went to Harvard for graduate school, and there did work on the structure of cognition, did his dissertation work. Then he was employed by Texas Tech, but he took a PNP fellowship at the WashU St. Louis, his further postdoc work in cognitive science and philosophy of cognitive science. And then eventually got a job at York University in philosophy, also has been the head of the cognitive science program, and is part of the Vision Research Center. So one of the things he's interested in, besides the work in on the number sense with Sam Clark, who was the first postdoc a couple years ago, with Brandon. He's interested more generally in whether cognitive science can bring scientific results to the table that resolve or make progress on old, outstanding philosophical issues. That's the instance of his work that we have today. It's a sort of new line for him, resurrecting the primary and secondary qualities. Please welcome Jake.
Thanks so much, Gary. It's nice to be back at Penn. You'll have to excuse me if I'm a little nervous. It's just that the last time I was invited to Penn, I was 18 years old, and I left with a bill for $250,000. But now I'm at York University up in Toronto, where we have the Center for Vision Research. And I have to say, you're very lucky to have me now, because Trump's tariffs go into effect on Tuesday, and then Canadian talks are going to be 25% more expensive. It's good timing. Okay, so I want to take you back to the 17th century, when thinkers such as Galileo and Robert Boyle and John Locke drew a new distinction. So this was a distinction that proved to be enormously influential in the history of ideas and the history of science. And the distinction was between primary qualities, such as size, shape, motion, solidity, and number on the one hand, and secondary qualities, such as color, sound, odor, taste, and warm or cold on the other. So for all of these thinkers, primary qualities were held to be more real or objective than secondary qualities in some sense, and to ground scientific explanation. This differed from the received scholastic view, according to which an object's color is really just as much in the object as its shape is. Right, so this bottle has a certain shape, but it also has a certain color, and for the scholastics, both are just in the bottle. Many of them subscribe to the view that the physical world ultimately consists of corpuscles, many of these thinkers. So corpuscles are like these microscopic bodies that are fully describable in terms of their size and shape and motion and other primary qualities. So that was the view back then. So to give you an example, Galileo wrote, "I do not believe that for exciting in us tastes, odors, and sounds there are required in external bodies anything but sizes, shapes, numbers, and slow or fast motion. And I think that if ears, tongues, and noses were taken away, shapes and numbers and motions would remain, but not odors or tastes or sounds. Another example comes from Robert Boyle. So in a similar vein, he wrote, "The perceptions of these impressions are by men called by several names as heat, color, sound, odor, and are commonly imagined to proceed from certain distinct and peculiar qualities in the external objects, which have some resemblance to the ideas their action upon the senses excites in the mind. Though indeed all these sensible qualities are but the effects of or consequence of the above-mentioned primary affections of matter, and the above mentioned primary affections of matter were size, shape, and motion." Note the word resemblance here. So Boyle is saying that it's ordinarily assumed that our ideas, our mental representations of colors resemble objective qualities in bodies. But he's denying that, right, along with Galileo. And this is even more explicit in John Locke. So he writes, "The ideas of primary qualities of bodies are resemblances of them, and their patterns do really exist in the bodies themselves. But the ideas produced in us by these secondary qualities have no resemblance of them at all. There is nothing like our ideas existing in the bodies themselves. They are, in the bodies we denominate from them, only a power to produce those sensations in us. And what is sweet, blue, or warm in idea is but the certain bulk, figure, and motion of the insensible parts in the bodies themselves." So I just want to note two ideas that we're going to come back to over and over again. One is that secondary qualities are, in a sense, less real or objective than primary qualities. And the other is the idea that primary qualities, or rather that ideas of primary qualities, right, our mental representation of primary qualities, resemble objective qualities in bodies, but that ideas of secondary qualities don't resemble anything objective in bodies. And this distinction between primary qualities and secondary qualities, which is new to the 17th century, Galileo is often credited as being the first one to mark this distinction, really helped to lay the groundwork for the scientific revolution. And to give you one example, so in the 18th century, you can see the distinction at play in Newton's optics. So I'll give you, here's Newton. And this sounds like something that could have been written by Boyle, right? It sounds very similar. "If at any time I speak of light and rays as colored or endued with colors, I would be understood to speak not philosophically and grossly, I'm sorry, I would be understood to speak not philosophically and properly, but grossly, and accordingly to such conceptions as vulgar people, in seeing all these experiments, would be apt to frame. For the rays, to speak properly, are not colored. In them there is nothing else than a certain power and disposition to stir up a sensation of this or that color." Right, so this is the primary secondary quality distinction was just enormously influential and I think really fruitful, trying to explain as much as possible in terms of primary qualities and without secondary qualities really helped physics and chemistry come into their own. But of course, a lot has changed in the last 400 years. So today's science is just very different than 17th century science. And so that raises a question. Should we still accept a primary secondary quality distinction in anything like the 17th century sense? And I'm going to argue that we should. And the new version of the distinction that I'll be defending, it divides things up in roughly the same way as the 17th century one. And it's going to respect some core features of the traditional distinction, but it won't be exactly the same. And so one big difference is this. Whereas the original distinction promised to reveal the nature of physical reality, the world outside of us, my version is instead going to tell us something about perception. So it teaches us about how we perceive the world rather than about how the world really is. And for the sake of today's talk, I'm going to use Locke's account as representative of the traditional approach. There are some differences among the 17th century accounts, but his was especially well elaborated, and it's really become the focus of a lot of work. Okay, so his account was especially rich, but it's also notoriously difficult to interpret. But through the haze, I think we can distinguish two core features of his account, which I've already sort of mentioned. So the first is that primary qualities are objective or real in a way that secondary qualities are not. Now, exactly what this objectivity comes to is a matter of debate. In a little bit, I'm going to show you two pretty standard interpretations of what Locke meant and explain why I think they're problematic from a contemporary perspective. The second core feature is that ideas of primary qualities resemble objective qualities in bodies, but that ideas of secondary qualities do not. So there are really two claims here, so one positive and one negative, right? The positive resemblance thesis is that ideas of primary qualities resemble objective qualities in bodies. And the negative resemblance thesis is that ideas of secondary qualities do not resemble anything objective in bodies. Some commentators emphasize one of these core features over the other, but most try to account for both features, and I'm gonna do the same. So while I take these to be the two most central features of Locke's distinction, there are two other features that I think are really important in order to understand Locke's project. So I'm gonna just mention those now. First, the primary-secondary quality distinction is grounded in two kinds of perceivable properties, perceivable qualities. So in other words, it only concerns qualities that can be perceived. Qualities that can't be perceived are neither primary nor secondary. And this makes sense given that resemblance is a core feature of the distinction, since if a quality can't be perceived, it isn't even a candidate for resemblance, right? How could our ideas resemble something if we're not representing it? One reason this matters is that philosophers sometimes try to embarrass the distinction by asking how it extends to other properties. So for example, whether being rust-proof or having a negative charge is a primary quality or a secondary quality. But given that these aren't perceptible properties, they don't correspond to what Locke called simple ideas, they aren't even candidates to be primary or secondary qualities. So you can kind of already see how the 17th century project might be going off the rails, right? We're grounding this distinction that's supposed to tell us about reality in things we perceive, right? Which just like from a contemporary perspective, I think is very jarring. Okay, so the second other feature I want to mention is what I call metaphysical indifference. So this is the idea that the primary-secondary quality distinction is not primarily about the metaphysical status of primary qualities and secondary qualities. So let me explain what I mean by that. So consider the color red. What is the color red? To make this concrete, suppose you see a red apple, right? So here's the apple. Here's your visual experience of the apple, as I'm sure you realize. We'll call that a sensation. The apple has a disposition or a power to cause that experience in you in normal conditions. So it causes this sensation. And it has that disposition because it has a certain texture or surface reflectance property that makes it reflect light in a certain way. So we can now ask, which of these properties is the color red? Is it the disposition to appear red in normal conditions? Is it the ground of that disposition, right, the surface reflectance? Or is red a sensation in your mind? Now, the dominant interpretation of Locke is that it's a disposition or power. But there are things that Locke says that are suggestive of each interpretation. And scholars disagree about what Locke intended. But interestingly, many scholars devote themselves to defending a specific interpretation. And I think common to these diverging interpretations is the thought that Locke, in a sense, was confused. He was really a proponent of one of these metaphysical views. He just lacked the clarity of mind to consistently say it. But I want to suggest an alternative way of looking at things. Maybe Locke was so cavalier about these distinctions because they're not at the heart of the primary-secondary quality distinction as he understood it. Okay, so I bring this up because these distinctions aren't going to be at the heart of the distinction as I spell it out either. And my view of the distinction is going to be compatible with different metaphysical takes on the nature of secondary qualities, right? What we say colors are, for example. And I should add that this isn't just a matter of interpretation. There's a substantive side to this as well. So there's a strain of the contemporary philosophical literature on color that's focused precisely on these questions, right? Is red a dispositional property? Is it the ground of that disposition? Is it a sensation? And there's just lots of debating back and forth. But I think it's natural to worry that this is largely a verbal issue. Everyone agrees that objects have categorical properties, surface reflectance properties. Everyone also agrees that normal human perceivers have experience of the colors. And everyone agrees that, right, the grounds have the disposition to cause those experiences in normal conditions. So the debate can appear to be just a matter of like which one we choose to call red. And it's hard to see that as an issue of great substance or importance. No, that's only one strain in the contemporary literature. There's lots that's more substantive, but it seems to me plausible that Locke wasn't interested in this particular strain, right? He had bigger fish to fry. And I think it's an advantage of the account I'm going to give that it also avoids this verbal dispute. Okay, so now that we have an idea of Locke's distinction between primary and secondary qualities, I can finally give you a roadmap for the rest of the talk. It's pretty simple. So in the first half, I'm going to explain why standard interpretations of objectivity and resemblance in Locke are problematic given our contemporary perspective. And then in the second half, I'm going to give a new way of understanding objectivity and resemblance, which is going to yield a new version of the primary-secondary quality distinction. And the new version, right, is anachronistic in the sense it's not intended as like an felicitous interpretation of Locke's text. But it divides things up in roughly the same way Locke did, and it respects all the four features I've just identified in Locke's account. So in that sense, it seems to be have something in common. Okay, so here's how should we interpret objectivity? Well, there's two familiar ways that I want to discuss. There's actually a bunch of ways, but here's two of them. So the first says that primary qualities are the most fundamental features of reality, right? These are the ones that are in the corpuscles, and everything's built up out of corpuscles. And so for Locke, these microscopic objects, corpuscles, have the very same properties, shape, size, and other primary qualities as macroscopic objects like tables and trees that we perceive. And so the fundamental and the perceptible line up. But this is really a non-starter today, right? So it's controversial, like what the most fundamental features of reality are according to contemporary science. Maybe it's 17 dimensions of strings. Whatever it is, it's not going to be things that we perceive like shape and size. And this is just one place where I think 21st century science looks very different than 17th century science. A second interpretation, standard interpretation of objectivity is that it means mind independence, where primary qualities do not depend on minds for their existence, but secondary qualities do. So think back to the quotation from Galileo, right? I think that if ears, tongues, and roses were taken away, shapes and numbers and motions would remain, but not odors or colors or sounds. If there were no more minds, there would be no more primary qualities, but there would still be, I'm sorry, there would be no more secondary qualities, but there would still be primary qualities. But the problem is that this interpretation relies on what is, by contemporary standards, a highly contentious view of secondary qualities. So to give one example, many people nowadays think of colors as surface reflectance properties, which exist independently of mind. So if you turn out the lights, right, the label on this bottle is still going to be blue because it still has the same reflectance property. It won't look blue, but it will still be blue. And so on many contemporary views of secondary qualities will be just as mind independent as primary qualities. And so this worry is voiced by Peter Ross in a survey of historical and contemporary approaches to the primary-secondary quality distinction. So he says, thus, considering the basis for the primary-secondary quality distinction as being a difference in perceiver dependence, and color to be the testing ground for the tenability of the distinction, there's reason to think the distinction fails. Color might be every bit as perceiver independent as shape. In other words, right, Ross is noticing that if the primary-secondary quality distinction is grounded in mind independence, and if contemporary color theorists are right that colors are mind independent, then it looks like the primary-secondary quality distinction just collapses. But instead of giving up the distinction, I'm going to recommend a different way to interpret objectivity. Okay, so just to summarize so far, here's a dilemma. If we interpret objectivity in terms of fundamentality, then neither primary qualities nor secondary qualities are objective, given our contemporary standards, right? If we interpret it to mean mind independence, then it looks like both might be objective. So we need a new way to think about objectivity. Okay, so that's objectivity. Now I want to talk about resemblance. As I mentioned, the resemblance thesis is really two theses. There's the positive resemblance thesis, which says that ideas of primary qualities resemble objective qualities in bodies. And then there's the negative resemblance thesis, which says that ideas of secondary qualities do not resemble objective qualities in bodies. And the worry that people have had forever is that the positive resemblance thesis makes no sense. So Berkeley wrote, how can that which is sensible be like that which is insensible? In a word, can anything be like a sensation or idea, but another sensation or idea? Right? So his worry is just that, look, nothing could resemble an idea except another idea. So it just doesn't make sense to suppose that your ideas are going to resemble something in the world. Writing in 1999, the Locke scholar Michael Jacovides points out that the positive resemblance thesis remains the difficult half. So this is, several hundred years later. From the standpoint of the 20th century, the positive thesis is the puzzler. Like Berkeley, we have no difficulty seeing how ideas of secondary qualities might not resemble something outside the mind. The difficulty lies in seeing how any ideas might. So as he points out, a toy replica of the Statue of Liberty, the kind you might find in a souvenir shop, resembles the Statue of Liberty because it has the same rough shape as the Statue of Liberty. But are we to suppose that your idea of the Statue of Liberty, right, your mental representation in your head, has the same shape as the Statue of Liberty? Right? That's really hard to make sense of. As a result, many commentators of Locke have just sided with Berkeley. And so they kind of just like ignore the resemblances. Let's just, obviously Berkeley's right about that. We'll put that aside. Or they water it down and say by resemblance, he really meant something else. Jacovides is an exception. So he says that Locke should be taken literally. Your idea of the Statue of Liberty literally has the same shape as the Statue of Liberty. But his justification is that this isn't a crazy view for a 17th century philosopher to hold. It's granted that it would be indefensible today, right? So his view is, look, if this seems crazy to you, That's just because you're not from the 17th century. By contrast, I want to argue that we can make sense of resemblance today. So that's what I'm going to do. Okay, so here's just an interim summary of where we are so far. 17th centuries, like Locke, distinguished primary qualities from secondary qualities. Right? Primary qualities like shape and size from secondary qualities like color, odor, and taste. This distinction had two core features, objectivity and resemblance. And as these have traditionally been understood, they're really problematic from our contemporary perspective. And that might seem to suggest that we should just like drop the distinction, just forget about it. But I think that would be premature. For one thing, I think many of us still have the intuition that shape, size, number, and motion just are different sorts of things than colors, tastes, and smells. And it's hard to believe there's really nothing to that. And so I'm going to suggest that we can make progress through a change in emphasis. So for Locke, the emphasis was really on learning about the physical world. He assumed that perception itself represents the most fundamental properties that go to the very essence of matter. And this assumption, I think, is just a non-starter today. But another way to approach the distinction takes our understanding of the physical world for granted and asks what we can learn about perception by thinking about the kinds of properties it represents and how it represents those. And so that's the approach I'm going to take. Okay, so I'm going to start with a new way to think about objectivity. So I think we can make sense of objectivity without fundamentality or mind independence. And the key is to contrast being objective with what I call being mind-centric. Okay, side note, I don't love the term mind-centric, and if anybody can think of a better term for me to use, I would really appreciate the help. Okay, end of side note. A property is mind-centric if it serves as a kind in mental explanations only. By contrast, a property is objective if it serves as a kind in non-mental explanations. Many objective properties have a home in a non-mental science like physics and chemistry, right? Mind-centric properties, by contrast, derive their significance from their role in characterizing minds and subjects with minds. They do not appear as kinds in non-mental explanations or find a home in non-mental sciences, right? So they're of interest, but they're only of interest because we're of interest and other creatures with minds are of interest. Locke's primary qualities are objective. So shape, size, motion, number, they all feature in non-mental explanations. In chemistry, for example, you might appeal to the shape of a molecule to explain its binding properties. These won't be the most fundamental kinds of our non-mental sciences, but they'll be kinds all the same. Many of Locke's secondary qualities are mind-centric, not objective, no matter how we do the metaphysics. Okay, so take colors. If colors are mind-dependent, so if we think they're sensations, then they're clearly mind-centric, right? Sensations don't feature as kinds in non-mental explanations. If they're dispositions or powers to cause certain experiences in us, they're still going to be mind-centric. And if they're the grounds of dispositions, right, if they're surface reflectance properties, they won't be mind-dependent, but they're still going to be mind-centric. And that's because the only candidates for what they could be are going to be wildly disjunctive from the perspective of non-mental sciences, right? So which things are going to count, which surface reflectances are going to count as red? It's going to be like being, right, this massive mixture of light, this other mixture, this other mixture. So there's a phenomenon known as metamerism where many different combinations of light can give rise to the same experience. And so if you think about what red is in terms of the surface reflectance, it's just going to be this massively disjunctive thing, not something that's going to show up in chemistry or in physics. It's only interesting because we're interested in us. And I think the same is going to be true of odor or taste. So for example, what is the sort of physical correlate of tasting minty? Well, it's just going to be a disjunction of different chemical compositions, right? There's not going to be something that's interesting from a sort of mind-independent perspective. Sound, yeah, sure. Go for it.
So it seems like that same topic could be applied to things like shape, right? So I break it down enough. You can also characterize shape as a collection of atoms that once you've arranged those pieces in a certain form, they have form, but depending on the granularity which you want to break.
Yeah.
Down, they also are not using synchronology, but immaterial, right? They also don't exist at a certain point, right? Same with like warm, cold. That is, there's a thermodynamic process.
Yeah. So hold on warm, cold, because I'm going to talk about that in a second. So shape. So what I want to say is, it's again not the most fundamental kinds, right? But the point is that there is a role for appealing to shape in non-mental explanations, right? So in chemistry, you might appeal to the shape of a molecule. And that's a perfectly legitimate explanation. So the background idea here is that there's different levels of explanations, right? And some of them are going to be mental, some are going to be non-mental. Among the non-mental, some are going to be more fundamental than others. And primary qualities just need to show up at some level, non-mental level of explanation. It doesn't have to be the most fundamental. So, okay, so. Right. Well, so the thought is that there, if you want to say what is red, what you would need is either being this surface reflectance property, or being this completely unrelated surface reflectance property, or being this differently related, where there's really nothing that they have in common except that we experience them as red. And so because of that, if you're explaining things as a chemist or as a physicist or doing any kind of non-mental explanation, you're not going to be explaining it in terms of quantifying over red. You might be appealing to wavelength, but not to the sort of massive disjunction of wavelengths that constitutes red. Okay. Right. Okay. So let me let's come back to that at the end because there's a lot to say about that. But yeah. So let me just come back to that. Okay. So hot and cold, I think, are tricky. So if you think we perceive temperature, that's objective. And then that would, right, that would make it objective rather than mind-centric. But some philosophers have argued that thermoreception is too narcissistic to count as representing temperature. Kathleen Akins argues this. Instead, it represents how things are with your own body. And if that's right, then hot and cold might be mind-centric properties too. And so we might be able to count them as mind-centric. Sound is not without complications, but I think timbre, right, the difference when you hear the same note and played by different instruments is pretty clearly going to be mind-centric. There's no physical correlate that shows up in non-mental explanations of timbre. Pitch, there is some correlation with frequency, but I don't think you can reduce pitch to frequency. So pitch has a helix structure with height and chroma, and chroma is periodic. And so I don't think you can reduce it to frequency. So frequency, of course, is an objective property. That shows up in non-mental explanations of serious non-mental explanations, but not pitch. Okay. Note that this way of defining objectivity takes our existing scientific explanations at face value. So it isn't trying to teach us about the physical world. It's not placing constraints on what the objective kinds will be. For example, that they need to be things we perceive. It's just saying that there are whatever kinds show up in the explanations that we get from non-mental sciences like physics and chemistry at any level. Okay. Okay, so now I want to return to the other core feature of the distinction, which is resemblance. Okay. The worry, remember, is that nothing can resemble an idea except another idea. And the reply I want to recommend is that we can tame resemblance by appeal to a structure-preserving mapping, something like an isomorphism, for example. And I'm going to start with magnitudes, things like size, number, distance, duration, velocity. That's the majority of the primary qualities. And then I'm going to look at shape. Okay, so the discrimination of many magnitudes obeys Weber's law. So this includes size, distance, duration, number. So here, m is the value of a magnitude. Delta m is the minimal change in the magnitude you need to just notice a difference. It's just noticeable difference. And k is a constant. So that's known as the Weber fraction. So for example, suppose you're presented with 20 dots on the screen, something I'm sure you've done many times to people. And it takes the difference of the addition of 2 dots for you to just notice a difference, right? Your Weber fraction would then be 1/10, 2 over 20, which would enable us to predict your just noticeable difference values for any numerical values. So we would know if you were presented with 10 dots, we'd only need to add 1 dot for you to notice the difference. If you were presented with 50 dots, we'd need to add 5 for you to notice the difference, and so on. So in other words, Weber's law says that the ability to discriminate 2 magnitudes is a linear function of their ratio. Okay, so Weber's law is indicative of an internal magnitude that mirrors or is isomorphic to the external magnitude it represents. And to see this, I think an analogy is helpful. Okay, suppose you're watching a basketball game between the Lakers and the Sixers. Improbably Joel Embiid is playing. To keep score, you use 2 cylindrical buckets, right? One to track the Lakers score and another to track the Sixers score. Each bucket is under a tap, and every time the Lakers or Sixers score a point, you open the tap, for a fixed duration, allowing a little water to pour into the corresponding bucket. So because the buckets are cylindrical, the height of the water in each bucket is just going to be a linear function of the corresponding team's score. And so you can use the height of the water in the bucket as a representation of each team's score. Intuitively, these representations resemble the score since there's a structure-preserving mapping between the height of the water in each bucket and the total points that each team scores, right? As the score goes up, so does the height of the water. And at the end of the game, you can determine the winner by comparing the water heights in each bucket. There might be some noise. The water might slosh around, interfering with comparisons, or unbeknownst to you, one bucket might leak more than the other or have a greater circumference than the other. But even with that noise, it's going to be easy enough to tell who won if the game is a blowout. But if it's like your typical NBA game, right, with each team scoring over 100 points and the game being decided by a buzzer beater, and then each team fouling the other and going back and forth to the free throw line several times. In that case, right, final score 117 to 116, it's going to not be a very reliable method. Okay, so we can draw some lessons from this analogy. So the first is that the bucket system illustrates how a mirroring or resemblance relation that's accompanied by an appropriate natural pattern of noise can give rise to the sort of ratio sensitivity that's associated with Weber's law. Now, to get Weber's law exactly, you need to pair the right kind of noise with the right kind of mapping. But there's very natural mappings and patterns of noise that can give you Weber's law, a linear mapping, right, and multiplicative noise, or a logarithmic mapping with constant noise will give you Weber's law. The key to this explanation is the fact that similarities among the magnitudes represented, the scores, are mirrored by similarities among the representations. So for example, the water heights. So just as a score of 40 points is more similar to a score of 50 points than to a score of 60 points, a height of 40 centimeters is more similar to a height of 50 centimeters than it is to a height of 60 centimeters. And so it's hard to determine the winning team when the scores are similar because the water heights are also similar and there's noise in the system. But note that digital representations don't have this property, right? So for example, the Arabic numeral 40 is not more similar to the Arabic numeral 50 than to the Arabic numeral 60, right? So digital representations are arbitrary. They don't resemble their reference. And so that gives us what I've called the argument from Weber's law, which has the form of an inference to the best explanation. So if perceptual vehicles mirror the magnitudes they represent, a simple and elegant explanation of Weber's law is available. But if they don't mirror the magnitudes they represent, no comparably simple and elegant explanation of Weber's law is available. And so perceptual vehicles mirror or resemble the magnitudes they represent. So what we have here is a contemporary defense of the positive resemblance thesis. Our percepts of primary qualities like size and number resemble primary qualities because there's a natural structure preserving mapping between them, right? As one goes up or down, so does the other. Okay, so I've said there's some vehicle that increases or decreases with the magnitude that's represented. But you might wonder, like, what are these vehicles? One option is to understand them in neural terms. So you might think of them as neural firing rates, right? As the number of dots on the screen increases, the firing rate of some population of neurons goes up. But there is another option. So in a more Lockean spirit, we could take them to be features of conscious experience. So for example, sensory magnitudes, a kind of a felt intensity. So as the number of dots on the screen goes up, there's a kind of felt sense of an increase in number. These don't have to be in competition. If you're an identity theorist about the mind brain, then you can allow that these come to the same thing. Okay, so I've argued that our representations of magnitudes like size, number, and velocity resemble those magnitudes. But what about shape, right? Shape is not a magnitude. So the argument so far is not going to work for shape. But there's some fairly old evidence of a resemblance relation there too. I'm just going to point to it. So in particular, mental rotation studies of the sort performed by Shepard and Metzler way back in the 70s suggest that when we use mental imagery, there's an internal vehicle that mirrors the shape itself. And that's because the time it takes to answer, right, whether two shapes are identical is a linear function of the degree to which they're out of rotation. That's imagery, not perception. But there's also evidence that imagery and perception recruit overlapping neural circuits and have the same format. And so there's reason to think that perceptual vehicles mirror external shapes. So obviously that's very quick. There's a lot you could ask about that. A version of this argument is spelled out in more detail in Ned Block's recent book, The Border Between Seeing and Thinking, if anyone's interested. Okay. But that at least suggests that maybe the sort of mirroring that you get for magnitudes extends to shape. Yeah. 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 So this is a bold empirical thesis.
But the same quality, like color, was a physical property here was.
Yeah.
Here is red as implemented into the form.
Yeah.
Bumped out of the secondary quality bucket.
Yeah, as long as it was an objective quality, yeah. So that's right. Okay, so we've explained the positive resemblance thesis, but you might wonder about the negative resemblance thesis. So insofar as you get Weber's law at all for secondary qualities, things like colors and tastes and odors, it tends to be defined over a mind-centric property, right? So you don't get resemblance or a structure-preserving mapping between our ideas of secondary qualities and anything objective in bodies, which is what the negative resemblance thesis says. Okay, so to bring things together, here's my proposal, kind of spelled out in a little more detail. So Q is going to be a perceptible quality, right? It could be number or shape or size or color. And V is a perceptual vehicle that represents Q. That could be a neural vehicle or it could be a sensory magnitude. Q is a primary quality just in case two conditions hold. The first is that Q is objective as opposed to mind-centric, right? It features as a kind in non-mental explanations. And then second, there is a natural structure-preserving mapping that V functions to bear towards Q. So one type of natural structure-preserving mapping is monotonic covariation. So as the quality increases or decreases, so does the vehicle. And that's what we see with magnitudes such as length, area, duration, distance, number, all primary qualities. By contrast, Q is a secondary quality if and only if Q is not a primary quality. In other words, if and only if either Q is not objective, right, it's mind-centric, or there is no natural structure-preserving mapping that V functions to bear towards Q. So take color. On most stories, I think this will help with your question. On most stories, color is going to be mind-centric and thus not objective. So it's going to violate the first clause. And that's going to be true whether colors are sensations, dispositions, or the grounds of those dispositions. But there is an alternative minority view that you sometimes see in physics textbooks, that colors are wavelengths, right? So like, you know, the sort you get when you run light through a prism, right? And you get a nice rainbow. That would make them objective, because wavelengths are, right, objective. They feature as kinds and non-mental explanations. But there is no natural mapping from internal vehicles to wavelengths because so many different combinations of light give rise to the experience of red. Okay, so we arrive at a distinction between primary and secondary qualities that's extensionally very close to the early modern distinction. And it respects the core features of their account, objectivity and resemblance. But there are some complications I want to highlight if we have time. How are we doing for time? We're fine? Okay. Okay. So I'll mention these then. First one is solidity. So this was an important primary quality for Locke. It's supposed to be the space-filling feature of matter. What makes matter right, more than sort of like just geometry. And according to Locke, we experience solidity through touch as a kind of impenetrability, right? What you might think of as felt pressure. And if you consider it that way, we might experience it as a magnitude since something can feel more or less impenetrable, right? You can get more or less pressure. And in that case, we would expect a mirroring relation as we get for other magnitudes. The problem is it's not clear that Locke thought of solidity as a magnitude. He arguably thought it was something more absolute, a complete filling of space that doesn't admit of degrees. Each corpuscle is fully solid. And if that's right, then it's not clear there could be a resemblance relation. Interestingly, Locke never says that the idea of solidity resembles. So he never actually says that solidity, that our idea of solidity resembles solidity. When he gives examples of resemblance, he never appeals to that one, maybe because he intuited that there was a bit of a problem here. Also, many commentators worry about how solidity fits with the other primary qualities precisely because it's unclear how we could perceive an absolute space-filling feature, how that could be a simple idea. And then solidity doesn't have a clear place also in post-17th century science because it was replaced by the notion of force, right, as the space-filling feature. So it's not clear that solidity in Locke's sense really deserves to be on a contemporary list of primary qualities in any case. So solidity, it's complicated. Warm, cold, as I said, is complicated for the reason before. It's going to turn on whether you think we perceive temperature as something more narcissistic. If lightness is luminance or reflectance, then I'm inclined to say it's a primary quality since it's objective, right? Luminance will appear in non-mental explanations. And we obey Weber's law with respect to luminance and reflectance. So this is a clear revision from Locke because he counts it as a secondary quality. Locke doesn't discuss loudness, so he doesn't distinguish the components of sound. He just talks about sound as a whole. And taken as a whole, I do think they're secondary qualities by my definition, but taken on its own, loudness, if it's just sound wave amplitude, would be a primary quality, right? And in a similar way, color as a whole is a secondary quality, but lightness might be a primary quality. Okay, so those are the kinds of caveats and complications. Okay, so I've been arguing that perception represents the world in two different ways. On the one hand, it represents objective properties. So if you think in terms of evolution, you can imagine that in these cases, the perceptual system was sculpted to the contours of the world, to the kinds that are out there when the world is carved independently of us. And there are obvious benefits to being able to represent objective properties like distance, number, shape, and size, since they're central to many physical, chemical, and other objective phenomena, right? They enter into law-like causal relations with one another in the mind-independent world. So an organism that can track them can put them to use in flexible ways. And so it's going to afford an organism with a significant informational advantage. There is evolutionary pressure for the mind really just to track these properties as they are in themselves. One way to do that is just to set up a mirroring relation. And properties of the mind come to mirror or resemble these properties in the world. And so we get perceptual systems that represent primary qualities, qualities that are objective rather than mind-centric, and that are represented by way of a kind of resemblance. On the other hand, the interests of the organism don't always correspond cleanly to the world as it is in itself. Sometimes it's useful to represent idiosyncratic features of the world, and in those cases, our perceptual systems are responsible for the categories they track, and there is no resemblance to anything objective, right? And that's when you represent secondary qualities. So we arrive at a new primary-secondary quality distinction. So this doesn't try to teach us about the fundamental nature of physical reality, like Locke did. Instead, it just begins with a distinction between two types of worldly properties, those that are objective and those that are mind-centric, and then tries to use them to illuminate perception, right? So it tells us about how we perceive the world. Thanks.
Hi, interesting talk. I had a thought about the list of your secondary properties.
Yeah.
A subset of them includes things that have traditionally been considered secondary senses, so olfaction, taste, auditory, right, perception compared to some visual properties. There is a long intellectual history, as probably now that, going back to Aristotle, that these things are sort of somewhat deficient or not as important compared to visual perceptions. There's a long line of work in linguistics and cross-linguistic research showing that claiming that languages encode terms that have to do with visual perception more steadily and stably and richly compared to the other senses. There's been some pushback against this view lately, thinking that the thinking is that this comes primarily from ear relations, right?
Right.
So I just wanted to see whether this is related.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, I wasn't drawing a distinction among the secondary qualities. One sort of distinction you might want to draw there is between perception and sensation. So some philosophers have argued that taste, smell, those are merely sensory faculties. You get sensation, but you don't get genuine perception. And one way to think about that is that you don't get full-blown representation with those faculties. And one argument people have given is that there are arguably no constancies in those faculties. And so only when you get perceptual constancies do you get full-blown representation. And if that's right, then if there are senses that don't have constancies, right, and this is like a strong empirical claim that smell and taste don't have constancies, then you might think they deserve to only be called sensation, not perception. So that's an argument that Tyler Burge has made, for example. Yeah, that, I mean, it wasn't something here, but that'd be one way to try to develop that. Yeah. Wait, so I just wanted to come back to you because I kind of put off your question to the end. I want to make sure we get to it. So you were worried. Yeah.
Based on its proximity to other objects. So yes, we could physically measure those things. That's true of the things that are secondary qualities also.
Yeah. So I agree there are tons of ways in which size and so one thing is like our perception of size and shape are distorted in various ways. But there's a further question, which is, do you therefore want to say that we don't perceive size and shape? Well, yes, we do, but the things we perceive when we perceive taste and smell, right, so we perceive, right, so when you perceive, you perceive an odor. What is an odor? And I want to say it's a sort of ugly disjunction of some sort of, maybe it's, so I mean, at the best case, I think for someone would be, it's an ugly disjunction of chemical properties. And I don't want to say that for distance or size, even though there are distortions. I want to say you are perceiving size and distance and shape, even though your perception of those things is distorted in various ways. Because I don't think there's anything, so in that case, I think there's something nearby that is objective that you could say we're perceiving, namely size and shape. And often what you find is that there are ways of explaining why our perceptual system is distorted in the way it is. So I'll give you an example, which isn't actually size or shape, but will help you maybe see where I'm coming from. Do we perceive, when we perceive loudness, do we perceive sound wave amplitude, which is an objective property, or not? And some people say, no, you're not perceiving sound wave amplitude. And the reason is that loudness is dependent on frequency. And at certain frequencies, things appear louder than they should if you were only sensitive to amplitude. But if you look at why that's the case, a common explanation is that it has to do with the shape of the ear canal, which has that shape in order to protect the tympanic membrane, right? And so you can see, so what I see there is the auditory system has the function of representing sound wave amplitude. But there are competing functions. One of them is not allowing its most sensitive parts to be damaged. And so there are certain distortions in how you perceive sound wave amplitude, but it's still functioning, right? In a sense, that's what it's trying to do, is recover sound wave amplitude. It's just not going to do so perfectly because there's other things that are really important. And so if you can explain away the distortions, then I think you can still say that it's tracking sound wave amplitude. And I'm going to want to say something similar about distance and size and shape, though it would take a lot of working out to do that. But I hope that helps you to see where I'm coming from.
Just as a point of
Yeah.
clarification, can you explain why you're abhorring the disjunct? So notice you agree that there were disjuncts in the problem.
Abhorring it in the case of,
Abhorring the disjunct in terms of trying to figure out the fundamental property.
right.
You want to disjunct this, say that.
Oh, yeah. So, oh, right. So in the case of color, for example. Right. Well, I didn't say it's not fundamental. I said it's not going to be a kind in a non-mental science. So you're not going to see it show up in the explanations of physics or chemistry, for example. And so that was all I meant by it not being objective. So, right, number, distance, shape, those show up in non-mental explanations, serious non-mental explanations. Maybe not the most fundamental ones in terms of string theory or something, but they show up in serious non-mental explanations. So yeah, I don't abhor it. I mean, I actually, you know, I mean, psychological kinds are, I think they're wonderful. I love them, and I like psychological explanation. It's just there is this distinction between different types of explanation. Yeah.
I guess separation of like these, like you say, objective or subjective qualities or properties. Wouldn't that really depend on the population of people that those qualities are being discussed? Because if you are in a population where maybe your language might involve more syllables or variations of syllables, or it might involve tongue clicks, those differences in sound that might seem imperceivable or might seem a little bit disjointed in terms of what makes them different and what makes them discrete to someone who doesn't speak that language, very different from a group of people who grew up speaking that language and can like very easily, I guess, make a mental representation of how those sounds are different.
Right. So there's a sort of general question here, which is, will the list of primary and secondary qualities vary interculturally or vary across species? Mm-hmm.
Can't think about that because I sense it, but does that mean that it's any less objective or that it's not objective or that you can't even categorize it, even if that is a real thing that happens?
So, I mean, I think this gives you a framework for looking in each case, right? So what you would do is you would go, look at dolphins or bats and see what is it exactly that they're tracking. And is it something that's going to be a sort of, some sort of mind-centric property? Or is it going to be a property that we, as it were, from a God's eye view, when we're explaining the world without minds in it, is going to be something we would latch onto anyway? And that would help determine in that case, whether it's a candidate for being a primary quality or not. You also have to get the resemblance. But, if you got the objectivity, then it would give you a kind of recipe for determining. But in theory, it's possible that something that's a primary quality for one species might not be for secondary, might be a secondary for another. That in theory, that's possible. Like maybe, dogs represent distance using digital representations, and so there's no resemblance. Like, I don't think that's true, but in theory, it's possible. And if it were, then you might get a different list. Yeah. Yeah, sorry, I cut you off, but I just, wanted to make sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Seems like distinction that's very which actually really like the mapping function. Something part of it depends on two sources of uncertainty. One is the scientific uncertainty of the sense to which we can measure the physical property of shape, number, etc. And then the cognitive science, neuroscience uncertainty of the extent to which we are getting an accurate measurement of our representation for the property. So we can only really talk about the extent to which is lying to the extent to which either of those are accurate, right? So even for something like number, we perceive sets across a lot of different variations, right? Things are connected. They
Yeah.
They move together, but we do have oneness, right? So at what physical level of measurement does that numerical quantity exist? At what point does that line? Actual numerical quantity and both those things seem relative or uncertain, right?
So I'm not entirely sure I'm following it, but here, let me try and rephrase it and tell me if you think. So, I mean, one question here is just, when would we want to say that we're perceiving number as opposed to some other more mind-centric property, especially given that there are ways in which our representation of number is going to depend on how things are grouped or, other sort of subtle factors. Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, so one thing about number is it always has to be measured relative to a criterion of individuation, right? So if I just ask you, how many, you have to say, well, how many what, right? And so, how many, I've got my closet full of shoes. How many? Are you talking about individual shoes, pairs of shoes, types of shoes versus, sneakers versus boots, and you're going to get different numbers. So number is always relative to a sortal. But I don't think that's a problem for, I mean, that's a fact about number, but our visual system also has sortals that it uses when it's, representing number. No, because well, as long as you think it's number that's being represented. So, and it's so number features in non-mental explanations, right? I mean, it's in every science, and so so it's going to be an objective kind. And then the question is there sufficient evidence to think that we're representing number as opposed to something else? That's a debate we could have, but I do think there is. And so I think that that the visual system does represent number. Some people have said it doesn't. Some people say it represents, they'll say it represents a numerosity. You ask them what the numerosity is, and they say, it's not a number, but I can't tell you what it is. Or they say it's a quanticle. And you say, well, what's a quanticle? And again, it's a proprietary secret. They won't tell you what it is. So I think that just represents number, but the way it, any type of representation is going to be limited by various factors and distorted in various ways, and that's fine. So I think it's just too high of a bar to think that you have to be like, a mathematician to represent number. And so I would say that we do represent number. Number is an objective property, and then there's this evidence of a resemblance relation given Weber's law. And so we and so it satisfies the conditions for being a primary quality. Thanks so much.